Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I am very excited because we are interviewing Mr. Hugh Padgham. Hugh Padgham was at the forefront of some of the greatest albums ever made, albums that are still listened to today as being sonic masterpieces. He, of course, is very famous for coming up with the drum sound on In the Air Tonight, which actually started with Peter Gabriel's song Intruder off of the third album, sometimes called Melt. So this is going to be a very exciting interview for me because we're going to get to talk about all of those incredible records and more.
Well, one of the albums that's on your list to talk about is Drama from Yes, okay?
Yep.
And I grew up, when I first started tape hopping as well, and I grew up going through my period of liking prog rock and stuff.
Me too.
And listening to Yes records, and I actually really like the those American bands like Return to Forever and the jazz rock thing as much as prog rock. But anyway, it was interesting to work with Yes, although not my favourite experience either. But anyway, Eddie Offord, who was sort of a hero of mine, because when I first worked at Advision as a tape op, they let you sometimes go to the library and take the tapes out and play just to mess around. And some of those early Yes albums, like Close to the Edge or Closer to the Edge, whatever it was called, I think it was recorded on 16 track. If you looked at the track split, it was absolutely impossible to put the faders up and mix it, because every 30 seconds or whatever was a completely different track split. That guy, Eddie Offord, was a genius, but stroke nutter as well, which is why he didn't sort of last through the albums. But he turned me on to these little tiny acoustic research speakers, and I thought they sounded pretty good, because in those days we'd only barely got from huge monitors to Oratones. People weren't really using NS10s. Maybe had just about come on the scene, but I found these things called AR-18s, which was sort of about the same size as NS10s. Acoustic Research AR-18s, and they cost £100 a pair. And I could honestly say that I think virtually all of these records that we're going to be talking about today were all 90% recorded and 100% mixed on the AR-18s, I'd say.
That's amazing.
£100 pair of speakers. And I used to do all my mastering either at Sterling Sound or latterly mostly at Masterdisc, and then in Portland with Bob Ludwig, who we all know is probably the most world famous mastering engineer. Anyway, we became and still are great friends, sadly, with all this stuff going on now, and no one sees as much as each other as they did. But I used to take my masters to Bob, and he was always so amazed. He said, I don't really want to touch it. There might be a dB here or there, tiny bit of compression somewhere maybe, but he basically used to. And so I said, well, that's incredible. I'm amazed. And he said, well, you're doing your job properly, which makes my job easier. And I think that's a good adage on all aspects of recording, don't you reckon?
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder how much those speakers go for now.
Well, probably nothing, actually. I don't think anybody does. Do you know what? Weirdly enough, I did some recording the other day, because I'm now involved in a little label called Gearbox Records. We're a jazz label. And we were at Rack Studios, and I very proudly, when AR stopped making the AR-18s, I bought about 6 pairs off them. And they've been sitting in my garage for ages. Anyway, I literally broke out a brand new pair. They must be 40 years old, right? Put them up. First thing that happened was the maintenance engineer or somebody put a spike through the monitors, they just collapsed. So even though they were brand new, the what do you call it? You know, the bit that attaches from the paper cone to the frame, you know, the rubbery type bit, just disintegrated. It had just, you know, what's the word? It had just.
I think disintegrated is pretty accurate.
Yeah. But I managed to get them reconed. There's a guy in London who still has AR-18 reconing kits.
Oh wow!
So they'll come to see another day. But I tend to use the old KRK V6. When I say old, they're probably 15 years ago, because I think KRK have changed hands a lot, haven't they? Or several times over the last few years. And then I had some bigger ones as well. So they had the V4, V6, V8, which were all square, very heavy. And then there was a one called the E8, which was the really posh one that had a sort of hexagonal shaped cabinet. And they were very keen at British Grove with those studios as well. With those speakers, I mean, at that studio.
Fantastic. Well, I'm gonna be looking up the AR-18s. Hopefully, I'll find a pair before we put the video out, and then there'll be none.
Yeah, I can always send you a pair. I think I've still got another couple that are probably almost unused.
Well, don't make that promise, because I'll hold you to it.
I'm not working so much these days. Sorry?
I said, don't make that promise, because I will hold you to it.
You have to send me something else in return.
Yeah, let's think. I'm sure.
But do you know, the worst thing I did, Warren, which I'm realizing now, is I eventually got my own studio together in about 2000, whenever it was, because I'd always traveled the world, and there was never any point or need to get my own studio, because I was either always in LA or New York or, you know, anywhere really. And so why would I have my own studio? And then eventually it's like, okay, I think now's the time to have my own studio. So I found this studio that was actually for sale, and to cut a long story short, bought it, and put this, it had a really nice, one of the last SSL 4000Gs ever made. It came from a studio in Japan, perfect condition. Anyway, to cut a long story short, about nearly 5 years ago now, it was just a joke, and I was just losing so much money on it. And I had this massive, great building as well, and we rented out. There was another guy called Chris Porter, you've probably heard of, engineer, producer. He did a lot of George Michael. He did a lot of George Michael stuff. Anyway, it wasn't even washing its face anywhere like it should have been, and I'm sure you're the same thing, where record companies just don't want to pay you any money, and so on and so forth. And I threw the toys out of the pram, and I literally pretty well sold the whole lot. We managed to get permission to sell the building as to change into residential, which basically went from a commercial building to resi. It doubled in value. So actually my investment was really good. But now I realize when I want to work, and when I do work for Gearbox, this label I'm involved with, and we like to do everything analog, and we make everything is on 180 gram vinyl as well, and we have our own disc mastering studio now. We're real old school. I realize that it's actually becoming virtually impossible to work analog the whole way through the chain now. It's becoming that bad. And do you know of British Grove Studios in London, Mark Knopfler's studio?
I've never worked there. I've seen beautiful footage from it. It looks incredible.
I mean, it is not only an amazing studio, but it's like a museum as well. So in the big control room, they've got a massive, great Neve 88R, and then they've got a Beatles Sgt. Pepper desk which they managed to get from EMI or radio station in Nigeria, I think. So it's not the actual one that was Sergeant Pepper's, but it's the same. And they've converted it so it all works with current levels and, mic things and stuff. And then they've got what I call an Abbey Road EMI Neve desk, which has got like the signal box faders as well, but it was the first iteration of a transistor, discrete transistor console. And then they've got a couple of other old bits of gear in there. And it's amazingly maintained. They've got 6 A800 Mark IIIs.
Wow.
And ATR 100s and so on and so forth. So anyway, we made this record, actually tracked it at RAK on the API because I love the room at RAK. And it's cheaper than British Grove as well. And then we mixed it at British Grove. They've got an API. Is it a Legacy? It's called in their mix room there. And it's a lovely sounding desk. And it's got Uptown automation on it. And sadly, it's beginning to show its age. And the fader automation works all right, but they've had to disconnect all the mutes, which is a pain. And because it was putting a high-pitched whistle out of the output, and there's nothing they can do much about it. But the worst thing I ever did was, I'm trying to get back to a very long story here, selling my SSL, because I could drive my SSL like a car. You don't think about it. I'm sure it's the same with you. I don't think the automation has ever been bettered by any other company. And I tried mixing this said record I'm talking about in another studio that had an SSL. Not only was it not very well looked after, their analog machines weren't right. We had to give up basically after a day. And you know what the message you get from everywhere now is? Oh, well, we only use 2 channels of it anyway.
Mm. Yeah.
So, the being able to record and mix with a basic automation totally analogly now is, I think there's 2 studios in London that can sort of handle it, and that's RAK and British Grove. Actually, Air London, Air Studios have got a decent SSL, but they still charge a bloody fortune. We're a little tiny record label. We can't afford $2,000 a day or whatever it is,
Yes, yes. I was there last year. It recently changed hands again, didn't it? Air Studios.
Yes, it has. Don't ask me who's bought it because I can't remember.
But I'm glad it's still being maintained as a studio.
Yeah. Do you know, I hate to say it might be a Russian who bought it.
Probably
because it was owned by it was owned by Strong Room, wasn't it?
Yes. It was a little bit ago, and I remember it was just before that the last Beatles thing that Giles did, because he was in there mixing it. So it was about a year and a half ago. So I think that's a good kind of segue, because we're still not past sort of 1980 or 81, to give us a little bit of discussion on drama, because of course, for those people that aren't aware, Trevor Horn, who goes from like singing new wave pop punk in the Buggles, also happened to sing and play bass with Yes on Drama, which is talk about talk about varied career.
I thought it was the weirdest thing ever in the whole wide world, and the reason I got involved was because I'd met Trevor. He came to the Townhouse doing Buggles stuff.
Yep.
And I did a mix of Video Killed the Radio Star, but he did so many mixes of it. I don't think anyone knows who actually did the end mix. I mean, he did literally.
Maybe he took a chorus from one and a verse from another.
I don't know. Who knows? But I liked
Trevor, but he was really strange. He had these very sort of thick glasses, and he would stare at you like this. But he would describe sounds like he would say, "Oh, can you put some more spry on the snare drum?" And you go, "Trevor, what the hell are you talking about? What's spry?" He'd say, inspiration, spry is inspiration. So I said, well, what's that? So I'd start sort of, yeah, that's it. You'd be like turning 10k up on the snare drum track or something. So he had this very, I thought, strange way of working. But anyway, he was great, and we did a few things, and I guess mostly with the Buggles. And then the next thing I know is they say, "Oh, can you engineer this album? That because we've got together with Yes." I can't remember exactly the story, but I could tell you they had this. Buggles and Yes had the same manager, who was a guy called Brian Lane, who had managed Yes for years. And Eddie Offord, the producer, also was managed by that time I was just starting to have a manager. I realized I needed to have a manager to do contracts and things like that. So I had a manager called Dennis Muirhead, and Dennis was a lawyer before he was a manager, and he had represented Eddie Offord years before. Anyway, so I ended up in the studio doing these backing tracks with Yes and Buggles. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. But when I was listening to the record the other day, first of all, Trevor sounds exactly like John Anderson, really. That sort of high...
It's incredible. You go from video killed the radio star to suddenly... Incredible.
It was more bizarre then. But I tell you what, first of all, I always rated Alan White as a drummer. He is an amazing drummer. Yeah. And he, as you probably know, played in the Plastic Ono band and played on Imagine and all that stuff. So that was great. But the whole session was like, as far as I was concerned, it was absolutely... I hated virtually every second of it. And I basically just did the backing tracks. Because you'd be sat there, and so Alan had come in, and maybe Steve Howe, the guitar player, and done something, and it's like, oh, we got to wait for Chris Squire, the bass player, to come. And sometimes you'd be waiting, he wouldn't turn up till like 2:00 in the morning. And, you were sort of meant to be working the next day. Honestly, it was a nightmare. And then Eddie Offord, poor Eddie, who's one of the most talented engineers, I think. I was telling you before about these track sheets and things. Cleverer than but mad as a box, totally mad. And I mean, it all I can say is that the session sort of degraded into sort of Spinal Tap, but not very nice Spinal Tap times 10. And it had gone on for a long time, and I literally could not, bless him because he's not alive now. If Chris Squire walked anywhere near me for the next sort of 20 years, if I ever saw him, I literally couldn't say, it was awful. And that's, it's just one of those things, isn't it? And so can you believe the relief when Trevor Horn had then literally during the album got married to this girl called Jill Sinclair, who ended up running, what's the record label called that Frankie Goes to Hollywood was on and all that?
Oh, ZZT.
ZTT Records.
Yeah, yeah.
And her brother, they were kind of a reasonably wealthy family. They already had a studio called Psalm Studios.
Absolutely,
which
yeah.
The original Psalm Studios was called Psalm East. Eventually they bought Island Studios and called that Psalm West. That didn't exist then. But so Trevor had realised that they were spending all this money at the townhouse and they could go to Psalm, where his new wife was, brother's studio. It'd be much easier to do that. So they went there to do all the overdubbing and a lot of the overdubbing, and I guess they mixed it there as well, because I never had anything to do with the record again. So my name's on it as a credit. And I can remember when I listened to it the other day, I can remember most of the tracking stuff, and so Eddie, I think, Eddie Offord didn't carry on after those sessions as well. I mean, we're talking, really weird stuff went on. I could go into detail, but it's probably not really very.
Well, so maybe we can talk about it privately.
Yeah, but anyway, it was weird. But what the amazing thing was that had I been carted off, say, to go to Psalm with Trevor, I would not have done XTC Black Sea.
Oh,
because that started literally the day or the week after Yes left the studio. Their block of time ran out, and off Trevor went with the band, and that is literally when we started doing XTC.
Well, that's crazy.
I was still a house engineer, paid absolutely nothing by Virgin at the townhouse. So it wasn't till kind of after I think I was still a house staff member when we did Face Value. So it was soon after. When did we do? Yeah, it was Black Sea was 80, wasn't it? It was about 81, maybe late 81 when I went to go freelance.
Incredible. I wanted to ask you about. This is funny. You go to All Music. The first credit they have you listed, I think, is really kind of cool. Is Derek and Clive.
Oh,
I don't know if this is going to translate to an American audience, but they'll know who played Derek and Clive, of course.
Well, yeah, they'll know Clive, probably not Derek. I mean, it did not translate into America at all, did it? But the very first Derek and Clive album, I think, was made at Electric Lady Studios in New York. And Peter Cook was there maybe with Dudley doing one of their shows, and I think they got bored one evening and decided to go to a studio, and that's how the first one happened. The one I did, which I think was the third and final one, was one of the first recordings actually ever made at the Townhouse in London.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was very funny. I mean, it was all recorded as well. I had a beard then, which was quite strange. Well, strange for me, but everybody has beards now. But yes, I remember it was quite. The studio was so new that I had two mics, and I thought, well, being speech and stuff, I better compress them and stuff. But because the studio was so new, we hadn't got a stereo link on the two Uri 1176s. And it still freaks me out today when I listen to it, because there's the two of them quite close to each other. And if one of them shouted, it compressed, but the other one didn't. So you can hear the sound traveling across like that. If you listen to it on headphones, I'm like mortified, because it's like, if you're a decent recording engineer, rule number one is, make sure you've got your stereo linking together in certain situations. So, but anyway, it was good fun. It was good fun. And I stayed friends with Peter for a bit after that, which was quite good. He was basically really angry and jealous that Dudley had gone to America and become a film star.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And he hadn't. If you sort of, yeah, that was really what it's all about. And if you listen to that record, it's actually Dudley came back. I don't think he really wanted to, and Peter had just come out of a drying out clinic, and he was struggling with Dudley, trying to sort of act with him or interact with him. And also he said, I can't be funny if I don't have a drink. So he started drinking again. Anyway, it's a whole album. We did 3 days recording at the Townhouse, and then we went to the Manor Studios and edited it. And of course, in those days, it's all pieces of 1/4-inch tape. And it took us over 2 weeks to edit it. And editing speech, I had to make little tiny marks or hang it on the wall with masking tape. God, it was a nightmare. And now, of course, you do it in a day. I mean, that's one of the only things that's good about, not only things, but modern recording and Pro Tools and stuff is the editing is just so much simpler, isn't it? I mean, if you're working in a studio analogly or even mixing down to analog or something like that, assistants look at you. First of all, they can't even put the tape on the machine. They don't know how to. They literally don't know how to put the tape on. And they go, "What's that?" Looking at the heads, and then if you start trying to do an edit, they look at you with unbelievable amazement. This is like from another world, which it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's what that's what we grew up with.
It is. I still have I have an A800 Mark II. So over there.
All right.
So
Cool.
yeah, it doesn't get used as much as it should. I'll be honest.
No, I tell you what I love doing at my studio towards the end, and this is a question that comes up in some of your questions, was I used to, if I had a band in or a rhythm section, at the very least I would try and get the drums, bass, maybe scratch guitars or whatever done on analog, and it would literally, as you played it back, it would go into Pro Tools. And I found that running high quality Pro Tools, you were still getting this thing which I find very difficult to describe to people. But the problem I've always had with recording particularly transient things like drums to digital is that the digital kind of doesn't know where to stop, whereas the analog is kind to the transients and it rounds them off. I mean, I'm known for a good drum sound anyway, but on analog. But I learned very early on how to record perfectly on analog, and it's so difficult for me still to record what I call really nice sounding. I mean, Pro Tools is much better than it used to be, or not Pro Tools, but the A to D converters are much better, and you can get the little limit features on. I had all Apogee stuff because of knowing Bob and Betty and stuff, so they used to give me a good deal. I still think it's still, you can't. I know it's part of your questions today, but you just can't beat the analog sound. We did this album the other day, jazz album. We do it 5 days, 3 days recording, 2 days mixing, and we went to 15 IPS Dolby SR. Quiet as a mouse, it is, and sounds absolutely fantastic.
I was going to say you would still be in your mid-20s when you've got production credits on, absolutely massive records. I mean, 81 is face value.
Yeah. Well, I would have been 26 then.
26.
I was born in 55. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I thought I was old. You know, I'd spent 4 years at Lansdowne, the place I was talking about before, that I thought that where I learnt a lot of good stuff, you know, and I was desperate to leave Lansdowne because I didn't want to do cheesy pop bands. I wanted to do cool stuff, and so when I got a job at Virgin, I was so pleased. And I'd been 4.5 years, I think, at Lansdowne. And if you spend 4 years doing something, you think you could be doing something else. It seems like a long time. So that's why I said when I was doing Phil Collins, age 26, now it seems like I was a baby. But at that point, it was like, what's kept me for so long, you know?
Finally.
It's so weird, isn't it?
I know, but incredible. You know, I just looking at 80 and 81, I mean, you're making 4 absolutely huge albums a year. I mean, it's that's pretty extensive amount of work. I want to bring you back a little bit because XTC are a personal favorite of mine. And those 2 albums are in my top 10 albums. Black Sea and English Settlement. I believe they're not as well known in America as you know. Living over here now, musicians love them. All the musicians I know love them, but they only really had one massive hit over here with a song called Dear God, which I don't actually believe was that as big in the UK, but
yeah,
just beautiful
sounding. That was
sounding.
the Todd Rundgren produced one.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, I didn't really know. I don't remember knowing the hit in the UK. But those 2 albums are just absolute masterpieces, both done at the Townhouse. They've got that drum sound, but it's more than that for me. It's like everything. I mean, like 12 strings. I mean, like songs like Yacht Dance, the acoustic tones on it. Everything is just a feast for your ears. And then, of course, those 2 guys as writers and both singers as well. Do you have any sort of memories of making the records? I'm asking a lot, going back 40 years.
Yeah. Well, I remember XTC probably more than a lot of bands, actually, because
Wonderful.
Like you, I was huge fan of theirs, very, very respectful. And I still keep up with Andy Partridge now.
Wonderful.
Not really the others, although Dave Gregory, there's an XTC podcast, you know, that you can, you might quite enjoy listening to. And Dave Gregory and I did one about a month ago, or maybe a couple of months ago now, about Black Sea, because it was the 40th anniversary this year, I think, of it. So that was quite fun talking about it. I didn't realise, actually, at the time that Dave, well, the whole band wasn't very happy, but I don't remember seeing that side of it much. Dave was unhappy because he felt he was only playing in the places that Andy didn't play, even though I think they complement each other amazingly. Andy was beginning to realise that touring was a real bind and was taking a toll on his mental health, and so on and so on and so forth. But I tell you one thing, XTC Drums and Wires, we recorded the whole album in 4 weeks, start to finish. And that you haven't got time to sit around and see and think, oh, is somebody unhappy or something like that? You know what I mean? You try making an album in 4 weeks now from scratch. It's a hard task, really. I mean, yes, I can do my jazz records in a few days, but not a record as sophisticated as that. They came in very well rehearsed, which helps. So, I mean, basically the songs were pretty well arranged and stuff. So it was a question of setting it up, trying to get the best sounds that you could and press record and go. Black Sea took maybe 2 weeks longer. I think it was maybe 6 weeks. So we probably spent, maybe 10 days of that mixing and spending a bit more time on the mixing, whereas Drums and Wires were probably a bit more hands-on, sort of, everybody let's mix 2 songs a day or whatever it was. And I can remember things that, like Terry, the drummer, who is the most amazing drummer, but
Incredible.
They're all the guys had no sort of self-confidence. They're from this town called Swindon, which is a sort of town in the country. Well, you would know, but probably people in America wouldn't. And they've got a sort of country accent that they talk a bit like that, and I think they were always denigrated by people and almost thought of as sort of not really being a premier class band, I think Colin once told me he thought that people thought they were a sort of poor man's Talking Heads or something, rather than just being, which is crazy when you think about it.
Yeah.
But so Terry, if he wasn't a drummer in a band, he would have been a bricklayer, a real sort of, almost working class sort of guy. And he was amazing. I mean, he was like the human drum machine. If Andy asked him to play something weird time signature, he would just get it immediately. And I don't think any of that stuff was ever played to clicks or anything like that. And anyway, by the end of the evening, we'd probably finish recording a backing track or whatever, and then try and do a couple of overdubs on it rather than leaving everything in one go. And Terry would always finish the session, put his drumstick, go out of the studio. There was an off license right next door to the studio, and he'd get his 6-pack of beer in, and he would sit. You know how studios always used to have the Chesterfield sofa at the back of it, especially those Westlake, Eastlake studios.
I want to flip the camera around because I still have one back here.
Anyway, he'd crack open a beer, and after about 2 or 3 beers, he would be sitting on the sofa and he'd go, "Oi, oi, that bit's not right. That bit's not right." And he'd start shouting. It was so funny. Oh yeah, look at all those guitars as well.
There it is. It's
excellent.
It's just, yeah.
Oh, I could talk so many anecdotes about Chesterfields and stuff. We whenever I was with Phil or I think it was probably not XTC, but we always used to work at Studio 2 in the SSL. It became my studio, and the stone room, as we used to call it, the drum room. But very often in Studio 1 there were posh bands like Queen, and so I became quite friendly with Queen, and because you'd meet up in, this is the thing nowadays with not having studios or people just working at home. There was this thing, we'd all meet up at supper time or lunchtime or whatever it was, and you'd chat and or just bump into people in the corridor. So Freddie, I got quite friendly with, and he used to invite me into the studio to come and have a listen to my new single or something. And I'd be going home, and he'd pour you a gin and tonic that had that much gin and that much tonic in it and stuff like that. But going back to XTC, oh my God, we had a few real laughs, and even though we worked quickly, I think almost the biggest laughs we had were the album I did, English Settlement, which actually we did at the Manor Studios, not at the Townhouse. But because the Stone Room had become so famous, for want of a better word, we actually built a similar room at the Manor Studios. Of course, every room sounds different, but we built something similar, which we used on the English Settlement record. We made the whole of that record there on the Helios desk.
Beautiful.
And in those days, being at a residential country studio, you used to book the studio by the week, and rather than 12-hour days that are often the case in the city. And so we would pretty well work 24/7 sort of thing, because you're paying for the week, so you might as well use it. And I ended up actually really, really resenting working at these residential studios, because you ended up being so tired. And often, as I'm sure you remember the case, if you're stuck in the studio, someone comes in and does their guitar overdub, then they go off and somebody else comes in and does their singing or their whatever overdub it might be, a wobble board, who knows. And you're the one who's stuck there the whole time, you and your assistant. And so it became, but we used to have this rule that on a Saturday night, we would finish early and get some beers in or whatever, and then start really late the next day. So what used to happen was the guys would get the beer in, but we'd still be in the studio. And so they started doing like covers of Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix Experience. And they would have all sorts of, they were great players who grew up in that whole era of heavy rock, all those bands, Zeppelin, Deep Purple, you name it. But they had all the songs off pat, and then and Andy would make up all these like really stupid lyrics to go along with it and stuff. And we used to have it was so funny. We used to have a great laugh. And then he would get half pissed and then hitch up his underpants and start dancing around the studio. Do you know what I mean by samurai?
Yeah.
Or those Japanese sumo wrestlers.
Yep.
Really big guys, and and he'd sort of do his impression of a sumo. I mean, honestly, it was when they were on form and being funny, they were extremely, extremely funny. But sadly, there was a dark side as well. And the English Settlement album, which was set to be a huge success in America, funnily enough, and that the single was Senses Working Overtime, which could have been a hit. And then Andy just basically he said, I can't tour anymore. I mean, it was really, really bad, actually. And that was sort of the end of XTC in that format, because after that, then Terry left the band. He went to live in Australia, and even now Colin and Andy don't even talk to each other.
Oh, that's a real shame.
Yeah. But
I'm not surprised with the Zeppelin thing.
I'm sure I've digressed way away.
No. I love it. I love
question.
I love this stuff. I'm not surprised. I was going to say about Terry and about the Zeppelin, because whenever I would hear Terry play, I always thought he's got to be a John Bonham fan. He just had that big, way of laying back the snare, sort of the very kind of right as late as you can get. And I always thought he's got to be a Bonham fan. So it's nice to hear you talk about it like that. And I mean, I'm a huge fan.
Funny enough, John. Yeah. No, I was going to say, funnily enough, John Bonham was a country boy as well. I mean, not from near Swindon, but not that far away. I mean, they were almost sort of like, John Bonham grew up as a sort of like a farmer's boy sort of thing. And him and Planty both came from the country, and Robert Plant was a mate of John Bonham's, and the others, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, were like very accomplished session musicians. I mean, you probably know all that story, but we're not here to talk about Zeppelin, are we?
No, but
although they are my favourite sort of heavy rock band, if that's what you want to call them.
Yep. I think many of us would agree with that. That's pretty fantastic. Peter Gabriel 3, which we've been, unofficially called Peter Gabriel 3, is one of my personal favorites. You mentioned Intruder. I feel like No Self-Control. Obviously, Games Without Frontiers is the hit. It's the big single from that. But
yeah,
when I hear No Self-Control, and is that a marimba at the front that's playing that part?
I think it is.
Yeah, I think
it is. But could it have? I don't think it would have been a sample.
No, I mean 1980. It sounds very performed.
It might have been this guy called Maurice Pert, who we used to use on percussion sometimes. But do you know what? I have no recollection of actually. I have a recollection of Maurice, but I don't have a recollection of Maurice playing the marimbas there. But I love that song too.
I think the most important thing about that song for me is just the creativity is just through the roof. You've got this, and what I love is, we talked earlier on about progressive rock, and you've got these guys like Peter and Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel coming from this sort of prog rock world, now doing stuff which was more, pop, more rock, more, and the ability to take something that has like this crazy marimba part, then goes into this huge drum sound where Phil Collins comes in, obviously using the techniques that you were developing during this record, and then goes to almost like I wouldn't say straight ahead, but like a pop, No Self-Control outro. It's just a masterpiece on all levels. But what I found interesting when you talk about Intruder, saying that Phil had put down the drum part and then Peter had written over it.
Yeah.
What was the sort of process on something like this? Because it's not like you can come in with no self-control and Peter comes in with an acoustic guitar and goes, "Hey, everybody, I've written this new track." I mean, I can't imagine how the production would have come about on a song like that.
Well, there was certainly no rehearsals or anything like that. I mean, Phil just turned up at the studio and was presented with Peter saying, "Play something like this." But do you know, it's so weird that you say that, because I don't have a recollection of how that song morphed into what it did, other than, well, first of all, I know the only song that was written around the drums was Intruder. So all the other songs would have had a semblance of something on them when Phil came to play on them. I think he played on 4, possibly 5, and Jerry Marotta played the drums on the others, if the tracks that did have drums. And so the other thing that was very unusual for those days is that we did the album over a period of nearly a year, I think, with breaks in between it. And we started off, Peter had a house that he rented down near Bath, and in the countryside, 100 odd miles out of London. And we did initial recording using a mobile recording track. In fact, the Manor Mobile, there was a Manor remote truck that had a little Helios desk in it as well. It was quite a good truck, really. And so a lot of early stuff was done on that. And then I remember there was a break, and it was only after that break that I think we then went to the Townhouse, and the majority of the rest of it was done at the Townhouse. But it was very much done bit by bit, and Peter would change his mind and experiment with something and then try something else. And a lot of weird stuff, went on. One day I remember, I can't remember which song it was now. Which song could it have been? Anyway, one of the girls in the reception at the studio just had a baby, and she came in with her baby one day, and Peter got this idea of like, maybe if we could get the baby to cry, I want to have, he would just come up with mad ideas. He saw the baby coming into the studio. Oh, what about if we got the baby to do something? So we persuaded the mother to drop the baby in the studio and then leave, walk out of the door. And sure enough, within 10 seconds, the baby started crying. So we recorded a bit of it, and then mother was, took the baby back. So then Peter said, all right, let's now try slowing the tape down. So we played it back at 7.5 IPS or whatever it was. Suddenly this baby crying sounded like a grown man sort of like dying. And it was like, oh my God, this is, we can't use this. So it never got used. But every day, and Peter's got a reputation for making records very slowly. And compared to how he ended up making records 2 or 3 along the line, especially when he got his own studio together. I mean, he was, famous for taking hours and hours and hours and days and weeks and weeks and weeks. And I tell you what, we were recording that on 24 track. There was no there weren't 48 tracks, even 48 track analog then. And it was all 24 track. And he would constantly want to change something or try something else. And in those days, you couldn't just, put something aside, like nowadays, where basically nothing ever gets thrown away. So for me, as like engineer, it's a bloody nightmare, And I remember there was always things wanting to be done, backward stuff, which meant turning the tape upside down. And I remember one day I actually did go over the overheads of one side of stereo left-right overheads of one of the drum tracks for about 20, 30 seconds or something before I realised that I was on the wrong track, because, of course, track 2 becomes track 23, if you see what I mean, when you turn it upside down. And if you get the wrong count... Anyway, I never did that again, but also I was so mortified, absolutely mortified. And it's probably somewhere in the mix where I had to make it go mono until, the overhead, until I got back the piece where I then go like that. And then the other thing was, it was one of the first records that we ever mixed with automation. And when we started the recording, you learned in the years to come that you always left track 24 open for the code, and in fact before that, the earlier system, you had to have 2 tracks because you would bounce from one to the other, and that was what was so amazing about the SSL, was that it was the first time a digital computer was able to run from one track of SMPTE code at 25 frames a second or whatever it was. Anyway, I hadn't sort of thought about this when we started recording. So after a few months or whatever, and we realised that it was going to be a hell of a lot too difficult to mix without having some sort of help with the automation, half the good stuff was on track 24. And because it just happened to be like that, because I didn't want to bounce. I mean, nowadays you go, why would you put a lead vocal on track 24? But anyway, it happened for whatever reasons. And so the only track that didn't seem to have much stuff of much importance on it all the way through all the tapes was track 17. I never forget this. So 17 ended up being striped with the code and running the computer off track 17. It's quite funny.
So with all this in mind, we touched on so many different things. One of the things, I'd sent you in that list of things to talk about, and you've touched on the SSL, but I would think of you as, king of an SSL. I mean, obviously the drum sound that you probably get asked about, every day of your life is inherently created through the SSL. Would you mind describing that? Because I know you've described. How many times have you described this? 20,000 times?
Maybe 30.
30,000.
Well, I mean, the great thing with SSL, when we were building the townhouse, and I say we, I was employed as staff before the whole thing was finished. And we started off with 2 studios, and Studio 1 would have the pucker expensive desk like they had at the Manor, which was a Helios. Same deal as Neve and so on, as you probably know. Very expensive, bespoke made. And then the powers that be said, look, we can't afford to put that in the second studio. And we'd rather have an inline desk because the control room's not as big. And so we'd rather have a desk that's got a smaller footprint. And so the big deal desks, in terms of that fitted all that, the criteria in those days, were MCI or Harrison. And then somebody told us, because the Manor Studios was near Oxford, SSL was a brand new little company, and their headquarters was just outside of Oxford. So it's like, oh wow, that's weird. Let's go and have a look there. So I remember going over on a Saturday afternoon or something and seeing the very first iteration of the console, which was even before the one that we ended up with at the townhouse, which was originally called a B series. Anyway, it was like, wow, this looks really cool, and it's got some amazing gimmicks on it. Well, not gimmicks, but things on it that even the inline MCI and Harrison didn't have, such as a limiter or a compressor and a noise gate on each channel. Now, that was unheard of. You were lucky if you went into a studio that maybe had half a dozen compressors and maybe half a dozen noise gates, if you were lucky. And you would have to be careful how you used them when you were recording. Well, I better keep one for the vocal or keep one for the bass or whatever. And so to have compressors on every channel, that was like a wow. So there was a few wow factors, and also the fact that it was English and we were flying the flag for England. We thought, sod it, we'll buy an SSL. And that's how we got the SSL there. And it was the very early one that we did the In the Air Tonight, and of course the Peter Gabriel Intruder thing before that. But we worked very closely with the guys at SSL and helped develop what became the later models, because it was still such a small company. And several of the maintenance engineers at the townhouse who had come, actually we'd stolen them from the BBC, went off to work for SSL and became, designers. A guy called Chris Jenkins, who was one of the, main designers who I still talk to. But anyway, going back to the earlier desk with the drum sound, one of the gimmicks on this desk was it had what's called a reverse talkback button. And when I say a gimmick, any console before, if you wanted to listen to somebody talking to you in the studio, you had to actually plug a microphone up into a channel of the desk. And even though you had the other way round, you always had talkback, so you could speak to them in headphones or speakers or whatever. No one had ever thought of this idea of having a microphone permanently plugged into the console. So all you had to do was press a button and you could hear what somebody was saying. So you didn't have to waste a channel, and B, you didn't have to bring the channel up and down all the time and make sure you hadn't recorded it onto the hi-hat track by mistake or something like that. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
So and then the idea of this listen mic reverse talkback thing was that we had two studio areas, and so there was the ability to plug 2 microphones in, and in order to hear anybody talking at any place in whichever studio they were in, they developed this massively huge compressor, which was then so it wasn't designed to be recorded at all. So one day during the Peter Gabriel album, Phil's in there playing the drums. We already had rule number 1 on that album was there were no cymbals allowed. This was Peter, before it started. No hi-hats, no cymbals. And that is a big, I'll come to that in a minute, a big thing about this drum sound. So one day, Phil's tuning his drums up, or messing around, and I pressed the reverse talkback button for whatever reason to hear him or his roadie talking. And suddenly there's this sound that comes out of the monitors. And everyone goes, bloody hell, that's unbelievable. Let's have some of that. And I said, well, sadly, we can't have some of that because it's rooted to the monitor matrix. I can't record it. I'm really sorry, unless we put a microphone in front of the monitor speaker. So that night, I said to the maintenance engineer on duty, can you please get the schematics out of the board and see if you can get a feed off this mic and put it into a spare patch point on the console. And that's what he did. Literally the next day, he did that. And so we were suddenly able to get that sound and put it on tape. So therefore, then I put it into a channel, and then I was mucking around with even more compression and the noise gate that was on the SSL channel. And that's when we discovered the thing of it closing down, because he played something and then it just suddenly shut off. And going from a really ambient sound to nothing in like a couple of milliseconds or whatever it was like really, as you know, a sort of strange sort of sounding phenomenon. So basically, we then, Phil got a drum pattern. So Peter says, okay, get a drum pattern together. So he got this drum pattern together that worked with the noise gate shutting off, because if he played it too fast, the gate wouldn't have had time to shut off. So we kind of fiddled around and it came up with this drum pattern, which then Phil played to a metronome. I mean, we're talking very early days of drum machines and all that. And I think he played to a metronome that we had that was there for orchestration purposes. When you used to be doing jingles or things like that, and the conductor would want a metronome, which was really a horrible sort of spike. Anyway, so we got the tempo together on the metronome so you could keep that. And he literally then played for about, I don't know, probably 10 minutes or something. So that drum sound, there's no editing, there's no looping, there's no nothing. It's just Phil playing literally for 5 or 10 minutes. And then Peter wrote the song around it.
Oh, wow.
And that's how that happened. And Phil was so impressed with this, and it sounded, like no one had ever, so, I obviously sort of impressed him enough for him 6 months later, when he wanted to make his own solo record, that he then asked me to produce it with him. And so, talk about luck and being in the right place at the right time, and these phenomenons happening. And the other thing, just funny little thing to finish off, anecdote about this drum sound, is that the mics that we put in the ceiling, basically, that were connected into the board, we just used any old mic that was lying around. And we had this thing called a Coles, I can't even remember what it was called now, but it's commonly known as a ball and biscuit, because it's got a ball and then it's got a flat bit on the bottom. It was a BBC Coles mic.
Was it a 4038?
I should have written down
Coles 4038?
No, isn't the 4038 the mic that's the sort of rounded one like that?
Sometimes
which
it's
is
a
a
BBC
ribbon mic.
Yeah, it's a ribbon.
It's a BBC mic again.
Yeah.
4038. I love that mic, and I still use it today on cymbals. and things. So all the Police records were all done with 4038s, but they were very dull, so you had to wind a load of top into them. But they sounded fantastic, and I still really rate many, many ribbon mics. I love ribbon mics. But anyway, the reason this mic was used was because people looked at it and said, it was actually a dynamic mic. No one would ever use that for recording anything. It was just lying around in a box. So we thought, sod it, we'll just stick that up. And that's how that mic. And then, do you know, just to finish off the story, because I feel like I'm probably boring you.
Not even in the slightest. This is more detail than I've ever heard anybody explain about this. So this is amazing.
Okay, cool. Well, it's probably, I hate to say, nearly 10 years since the townhouse closed down.
Very sad.
And yeah, really sad. And then, so my friend who basically built the Mark Knopfler's British Grove Studios, who even more sadly is a guy called David Stewart, and he died earlier this year from coronavirus.
Oh,
really,
terrible.
Really sad. But he put the whole studio together, and he is like, he makes me look like an amateur in terms of nerdiness, you know. When he heard the townhouse was closing down, he ran up there. He managed to persuade whoever was there that day to sell him that ball and biscuit mic that was hanging in the room. Although I think it had been taken down. It was in a box. He bought it back, and a few days later he rang me up and he said, "I got a present for you." And he said, "I went and got that ball and biscuit mic, the same one that the drum sounds from." And he gave it to me. And I was so, I couldn't believe that someone would do that. And they've got, when you go into British Grove Studios, they've got like a showcase, and they put, if they bought some really interesting, old, unusual piece of gear, they put it in there. Like I said, it's a bit like a museum. So I said, "Look, it's just going to go into my garage. You have it." So I donated it back to the studio, and it sits there in this glass cabinet to this day.
Oh, beautiful.
That mic.
That's incredible. I haven't heard the detail on the microphone, and obviously that's a key ingredient. But I love that idea of like, well, we don't use this much, so we'll use it for this job.
I know. It doesn't. I just while we're chatting and stuff, I'll just see if I can get a picture of it up on the on my thing, because it's quite funny. It's called an STC 4021.
4021, STC 4021.
You found it?
Yeah, I found it. There's a piece of one for sale on Reverb. I'm already looking it up. A piece of one.
Yeah.
Ball and biscuit microphones, sometimes called apple and biscuit, says somebody here.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, ball and biscuit. Here's one for $407 in a case.
Wow. Better buy it immediately.
I probably will. It's I talked to Val Garay years ago, and he told me that all of the guitar sounds he got weren't with the 57, they were with an SM53. And I didn't buy any, but they were all loads sell for about $100. And then after the video came up, they went to like $500 or $600 because there's probably only like 50 or 100 of these things in the world, you know. And then suddenly 200 people are trying to buy them.
Yeah. I find it such a strange thing with microphones because, for instance, you know the Beatles recording book, don't you?
Yes,
you know,
I have
the big fat book that these guys made that I've got. And you see all the mics that they used for the Beatles that Jeff Emerick used, and they're all mics that you never really see anymore. A lot of them you don't see anymore. I mean, you do see obviously the C12s and you know some of those, but the condenser mics, dynamic mics that they used to use on drums and things, you never sort of see them, and it's weird. And just on that subject, very quickly, it's the hallowed ground studio to EMI Abbey Road, isn't it? People, the Beatles and all this. Well, I must have recorded maybe a good half dozen sessions in that studio over the years. And every session I've ever recorded in that studio sounds shit.
That's a soundbite if ever I heard one.
Yeah, it's so weird, isn't it? I just could not ever get a good sound there. The last time I ever recorded there, I think, was with Sting, and we did a gospel choir, and we got this gospel choir in from the East End of London, and there must have been 40 of them, if not more, boys and girls, women, men, and I mic'd it up as far as I knew how to do it, and got the Abbey Road assistant to help and everything. It sounded like there was about 4 of them when I listened to it out of the studio. It was rubbish. It's so weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose you are fairly synonymous with rooms, with the sound of a room being in so many of your recordings. And when I think about Beatles albums that we all know and love, I hear room, but I don't hear room. I don't hear like the ambience of the room. So yeah, probably.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a massive Beatles fan and I think the records sound amazing, but the equipment, even in the era when I first started going there, which was probably, sometime in the early 80s, it had all completely changed.
Right.
And so it's hard. It's really hard to compare. Really, different desks, different mic amps, different, mics. Who knows? Different cables.
Absolutely. So Genesis. That
yes.
Obviously, you've had the success of Abacab, so you're a shoe-in to do the next album, I assume.
Yeah, and I think we did this one called Three Sides Live before.
Oh yeah, you did Three Sides Live, yeah.
Genesis. Well, Three Sides Live doesn't mean there was only one side that was studio, and I can't even remember the songs on that, so that it almost didn't really count, I suppose.
It's actually, to me, it's like it's one of my favorite albums.
It had Mama on it.
Yeah, it had Mama on it.
You what?
It's one of my favorite Genesis albums, including Nursery Crime and all the prog stuff from before, because I feel like Mama is an incredible song, but that's all. It's like a Beatles song to me. It's like, it's that bridge section. I can leave, but I won't go. When that comes in, it reminds me of of any great Beatles song where every single section could be a chorus. It's just such a great pop song in the best sense of the word.
The drum fills are a homage to Ringo as well, really, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just a wonderful, wonderful album, and it stands the test of time. You go, I went back and listened to it just like you before this interview, and just like starting off with Mama, which is such a powerful song, and then just going into this like just hook after hook song, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful record. I mean, it feels like they were in a great place.
Yeah, no, I think they were. I tell you the song I really don't like. I always skip over it. I don't usually listen to my own records very often.
Yeah.
But Illegal Alien.
I was going to ask if it was that.
Favorite.
I was going to ask if it was that one. When you started saying it, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if he's going to say Illegal Alien.
And then the other thing, which is all right, but I don't think the test of time hasn't really worked. So I don't particularly like the sort of Lynn drums and Simmons drums,
Sure.
Which, for instance, on the Home by the Sea, I think the snare drum is, and we even play one of the XTC songs on Black Sea. I think it's got but again, at the time, we thought this was cool, man. Let's use it. And the album, the Genesis album that was probably the most successful of all of them I did was after Genesis Invisible Touch.
Masterpiece.
And there's electronic drums all over that album. And last time I listened to it, I thought, oh God, I'd really like to go back and re-record the album and take all those drums off, because they make it sound like 1986, you know, rather than sort of timeless to me. But I prefer Genesis to I think it's one of my favourite Genesis records as well.
Yeah, it really stands the test of time. But I feel like those moments where, you know, you guys are all experimenting and trying out, you know, whatever the latest thing was, works because it feels eclectic. One of the things I think, you know, we grew up loving when you think of albums like Revolver or something, is the fact that there isn't a sound. You know, it's experimental. Every song, you know, you're working to the strength of the song. Like if you listen to Mama and That's All after each other, there couldn't be two more different approaches and two completely different sides of Genesis. But that's what makes the record so good, is that, you know, it's not like these days I tend to put an album on, even by some of my favorite artists, and I feel like I'm listening to a theme of just 10 variations of the same song. You know, the same drum sound, the same, you know, where this album is just a masterpiece of, it keeps my interest the whole time.
Yeah, no, it is good. I agree. The other thing that I really, when I do listen to the songs, and of course I was listening over the last few days prior to this talk that we're doing now, is I absolutely love Tony Banks. He had this synthesizer called an ARP Quadra, which I don't remember anyone else having at all. And it's got that mean sawtooth waveform, nasty type sounds, you know, going from Genesis 10 years before that was all rather nice and sort of, you know, not smooth, but you know what I mean, Hammond organs and whatever else they were using in those days. And for when Tony, which is so unlike his personality as well, because he's very charming and nice and soft and quiet, and he's got this mean sounding synth that he uses all over. I mean, he had some of it on Abacab as well, but there's a lot of it on Genesis, which I think is really is a great contributor to contribution to the whole sound. But yeah, that was, it was good fun to make. I'm just sort of looking if I've got any more thoughts on it, really. That was okay. Then again, I've got this thing. It was the first album that they made that was completely written, rehearsed, recorded, and mixed, I guess, all as together as the three people at that studio. They all lived within a 5 or 10 mile radius of the studio, so they'd come in every day, and the whole album, the concept of it, of which sometimes I wasn't there, but they were coming in and writing, just jamming rather, in the studio, and they would have a cassette recorder going the whole time, and they would just jam bits that they would make up at the time or whatever, and then they would jam all day, then go home and listen to these bits, and then Phil would come back and say, oh, you know, that bit that we did yesterday might go with that bit if we changed its key or something, and that might make a chorus, and that's a verse, and so it was all done like that together, whereas before I think Tony had come in with songs that he had sort of, you know, more or less written or half written or whatever. So this was the first album that they did literally as an entirety, and I think that's one reason why it ended up being called Genesis, because partly because they couldn't think of a name for it, and partly because it was Genesis, the three of them. And so it seemed an apt title to call it.
That makes perfect sense, because if to talk about That's All for a second, Tony's piano riff and that is super hooky. So ba ba da da dum 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 dum, and of course that's also the vocal line. Then you've got like what could be maybe it's Mike Rutherford playing this kind of beatly jangle guitar part. I mean, it whether they were the guys that wrote those individual parts, it just feels like everybody's putting their best efforts towards something. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It sounds really harmonious, doesn't it, in that sense? And I love the sort of long Second Home by the Sea, isn't it? The last one on side one. It's great, apart from Illegal Alien.
Which I understand.
You probably like it. It was always, for me, it was always like desperate working, not just with Genesis, working with great bands. I mean, I did an album with David Bowie, and my most cringe-worthy song on the whole record was the one they chose as the first single, and I would have left it off the whole album. And so you must have had that happen before, where you think this is the worst song on the album by far, and yet it turns out, Mr. A&R guy thinks it's a single.
I think the biggest one for me, and maybe was loving a song that nobody else thinks should be a single. That's I remember working with the Fray on their second album, and there's a song called Enough for Now, and it's such a beautiful song, and I know what the song was about, and it really resonated with me, and I spent lots of extra hours like giving it love and making sure. And the singer trusted me. He's like, I think this is a single as well. We've only gone through 2 years. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. I think anybody that's watching by this point has got a pretty good idea why I'm such a huge fan of this period, and such a huge fan of the records that you made, and a huge fan of you. I mean, we've really,
we'll have to do a series 2.
I think we have to do a series 2, yeah, because
episode 2 rather.
I mean, we haven't even got to like 82, and you've got Kate Bush, The Dreaming in there. You've got, a huge Kate Bush fan as well. I mean, we only talked about the idea of you working on Face Value, let alone, obviously, of course, Abacab. Chronologically, that came out before, but which did you do first? Did you track Phil Collins solo or the Genesis record first?
We did. I did Face Value first. It's really weird. I get confused as well because, comparatively speaking, we make records quite quickly. Other than the Peter Gabriel, but even that was quick compared to how he works nowadays. But for whatever reason, the record company either didn't put it out because it was coming up to Christmas, or you know what I mean. You didn't put out a record just before Christmas because you didn't want to get beaten by Michael Jackson's.
And one Christmas wonders whether
Carol or whatever it was.
One does speculate that possibly you'd want to put your band record out before you put your solo record out.
Well, yeah. Do you know? I can't really remember the reason, but I do. I remember the making of Abacab really well because I think when Phil first suggested me working with the band, which was amazing because I grew up at school listening to Genesis. When Peter was still in the band, and being a good private school boy, as they all went to private school as well. We all thought that we were a sort of family, if you know what I mean. Not that I knew them from Adam. So to end up working with Peter and then Genesis was like a dream come true, really, a massive dream come true. But so really, I suppose after the experience of working with Phil then put it to the band. To the Genesis band that he'd like me to work with him, which was fine. But I think, you see, because I think In the Air had been a bit of a hit.
Right.
And Tony Banks the keyboard player, was a bit jealous of. I say this because we still, whenever I see Tony, we have a bit of a sort of niggle type argument about it. He was a bit miffed that, first of all, Phil had solo success, because I think Tony had tried to do a solo album before, but he doesn't sing, so it wasn't going to be very big. And secondly, having somebody come in outside of the fold who was already in Phil's fold, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
So he was never unfriendly, but I just got the feeling that, hang on, here's this slight imposter, coming in. And also the remit for making Abacab and Genesis record was, it was new, partly because the idea, their collective idea, more than mine, I would say, was to let's have more accessible, shorter songs. My thing was, okay, well, if we want to have a good sound, we can't have 28 minutes on a side, because in those days you had to cut the damn thing, so it made a big difference. And so me being quite precious about getting good drum sounds and things, if you couldn't sort of cut it at a decent level, then so there was all these things. And also they built their own studio then, which was called the Farm, Fisher Lane Farm, which is what then was used for several albums after that, or loads of albums after that. But when I did Abacab, it was all down to me and this guy called Jeff, who was their technical guy, to get the studio together. And I'd had experience at the Townhouse, but not really totally doing it myself. And I tell you what, it was an absolute nightmare. I remember having sleepless nights because we couldn't get something to work and then the band were like chomping at the bit to want to start recording. And so when we started recording that album, it was on a Studer A80, so that was before we bought A800s. It was an AMEC console, which actually sounded all right. So there was a sort of budget that we were spending and the mics and so on. And it was all very, very new and untried. And it was, that feeling when you've recorded a great take, but you've recorded the hi-hat on the bass drum track or something like that. You know what I mean? There's some sort of major technical engineering error you've made. And I remember just, sort of having that going on the whole time. And the control room was it was really, really small. We soon after that, because the whole concept of it had been successful, we built a whole new control room and bought a massive, great SSL, and it was the control room was so big you could put a drum kit in it easily, and so on. But that Abacab album, I remember, was really, I was scared shitless recording most of it, to be honest. But it worked out well. But when I was playing it the other day before this interview, I remember thinking, God, yes, this was, it wasn't a nightmare, but it was like, oh, you know what it's like when you set up a studio.
Sure. Yeah. I've had that exact experience more times than I care to mention. Yeah.
Someone's wired a XLR socket out of phase or something, and to all the others, and I don't need to tell you, but
no, I
preaching to the converted.
Yes, but I totally understand. I mean, that album is a masterpiece. It's like to me, it's exactly what you're describing. It's like a pop prog record. I mean, the single itself, Abacab, I think the actual album version is like 7 minutes long, but obviously they edited it down for a single release, or maybe they didn't. Maybe my recollection is they just played it. But the musicality of all of these things we're talking about, XTC, Peter Gabriel, Genesis, obviously Phil Collins solo. I mean, just so far we've got, and of course, Yes Drama. I mean, the musicality is just through the roof. Not to mention, they can also write a song that can go on the radio. But even in those days, it was still special, though. You must have realized, there must be some realization that you're working with very high-level musicianship that could cross boundaries like nobody had done before or has really done since.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's very kind of you to say that. I mean, I think I learned very early on that working with bands like this is very much your job as producer or even engineer or whatever is to make the process feel and seem easy and seamless, and also your job is just as much being a diplomat as knowing your technical stuff. I mean, when's the right time to tell Phil that chorus was horrendously out of tune or something like that? You know what I mean? Yeah. And in those days, of course, no, none of these stupid tools that they have now. But you know what I mean? Just stroking people's egos at the right time, making it appear that there isn't a problem, even if there is a problem, and that sort of thing. I think that's all really important. And to I think for the majority of these albums we're talking about, there was always a pretty good atmosphere in the studio. I mean, I did talk before about XTC Black Sea. There was stuff going along in the background there a bit, which I never really copped hold of. But as far as I remember, the actual atmosphere in the control room at the time with the band was always pretty good, And I do think that is a very important aspect, isn't it, of making
absolutely records. But it's a testament to your ability to create that atmosphere as well.
I've always called myself a sort of chameleon, really. I don't want to sort of... I'm not like an autocratic sort of guy who goes in and says, you've got to do it this way. I mean, someone like Trevor Horn, who's a good friend of mine, I couldn't make the records he has made at all because I just couldn't do it. And he's, it's almost like it's his thing and it's his sound. I mean, the records he made at one point, he was as famous as the artists were. But I'm not like that. Give me a band and I will try and make the best out of it, whether it be a blues band or a prog band or a pop band or whatever. That's why I use the word chameleon. I try and sort of just melt myself and into the whatever the scenario or vibe is. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks ever so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. There's going to be more in this series. There's 2 more of these with Hugh Padgham. And of course, coming up very soon, it's a breakdown of In the Air Tonight, the classic song by Mr. Phil Collins.